Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. Today I'm here with Corey DeAngelis, who is the senior fellow at the American Federation for Children, and he has been labeled as the school choice evangelist. And so he recently wrote a book called The Parent Revolution, and I'm excited to talk to him about it because there's a whole lot of stuff that's been going on with schools, and that's just been been bubbling for a while, and I think it's now just come to the surface. So, Corey, first of all, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into this, because I think a lot of times, especially among when you're looking at political stuff and political topics, I think we get so caught up in the memes that we see, or it used to be the bumper stickers and these little minute bites. So let's start with define school choice. Define what that means, because I want to make certain
Yep.
everybody actually understands that where it is, the limitations on it. So if you can kind of play with that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so school choice is any policy that allows families to take their children's taxpayer-funded education dollars to the school that works best for them. So, in most places in the United States, you live in wherever you live, and you're assigned by your address to a residentially assigned government-run school, and you have to take all of your tax dollars there. If you want to go somewhere else, you either have to move houses or you have to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees, or pay for the cost of home-based education. So school choice policies, they can look at a lot of different ways, but the basic idea is allowing the money to follow the student. That's the money that's meant for educating your child to the school that works best. That could be another public school, that could be a private school, a charter school, or a home-based education option, including micro schools or one-room schoolhouses. So that's the simplest definition I can give you. Any policy that allows the money that currently it goes to your assigned monopoly school, you can take it somewhere else. It's kind of like the idea of Pell Grants for higher education. With higher education, you can take that scholarship to the public university in your area if you want. You can even take it to a community college, but you can also take Pell Grants to a private or even religious university as well. We do the same thing with so many other taxpayer-funded initiatives, from pre-K programs to even food stamps, Medicaid. All these are types of vouchers that can be used at a place of the choosing of the family. Only in K through 12 education does the government take that money from you and tell you that you must spend it all at one place. And it's a lot of money. We spend about $20,000 per student per year in the government-run school system today. So look, families should be able to take some of that, maybe even just half of that, to a school that works best for them. And there's now 11 states that have passed what I call universal school choice, meaning everybody's eligible. There's no picking winners and losers, because for a long time, the school choice movement has kind of done this incremental reform thing where maybe it was just for low income families, maybe it was just for students with special needs. Now we've gone from 0 to 100 real quick on the issue. It's because the teachers unions played their hand, but now 11 states have passed Milton Friedman's vision. He's the Nobel laureate free market economist who came up with this idea back in his essay in 1955 called the Role of Government in Education. He talked about having the funding follow the student, and now we're actually seeing this happening because parents saw through remote learning what was happening in the classroom, and people who thought their kids were in good public schools based on the test scores started to say, hey, something else is going on here. The curriculum is not aligned with my values. I don't want to send my kid to Caesar anymore, and be surprised when my kids come home as Romans, to take a quote from Bodie Bacham.
So I like that quote too. Love Odie as well. So I remember when I was in law school, there was a Supreme Court case, and I don't remember much about it outside of they were determining whether or not it was allowable for schools to take it was with the county. It was based off of property taxes. So therefore, schools that had lower property taxes had weaker schools than schools that had higher property taxes. You're looking at and so there was a massive amount of discrepancy among them, and the Supreme Court upheld that and said that's perfectly fine. I don't know if that's still the standard in most states, but if that is, doesn't that kind of mess everything up, and the schools that are left behind with students, doesn't that mess it up when they all start moving to these kind of these fancier schools? And then how is that afforded if it's all based off of county property taxes?
Yeah, these policies are typically passed at the state level in the legislature. So schools are funded based on three different primary sources. One from local property taxes, what you're talking about, also state sources, and also federal sources. Those federal sources shouldn't exist at all. It's only 8% of the total, but the word education is not in the US Constitution. We should abolish the Department of Education. It should have never existed in the first place. It was actually passed and built in 1979. It was a payoff to the teachers union in exchange for their endorsement, basically. But that's a totally separate conversation. The way that these are passed, it's typically at the state level, so the state funding would follow the child. The local property tax revenues stay exactly the same. And so localities can determine what to do with that funding. Sometimes it still goes to the assigned school. Sometimes they can use it on other projects, but this only touches that state funding that is based on the number of students in your school. So in Arizona, for example, they passed universal school choice and they broke the government website. So many families were flocking to that website to get a better opportunity for their kids that 80,000 families have now signed up since 2022.
Wow.
It crashed the government website on the first
Wow.
day. And one, that shows you that people really want this. But two, the way that it works is their government schools in Arizona spend like 14 to 15,000 per kid. They get to take the state portion, which is about $7,000 per kid, to the school that works best for them. So look, one of the main arguments you'll hear from the other side is that, well, what about the kids who remain in the public schools that, the $7,000 is leaving the school? My response is, well, competition is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And we have so much evidence all across the nation on this, that when public schools have to up their game in response to competition, they do so. Competition works in every other industry. It works in education as well. And we've seen this play out in Florida. Florida has expanded school choice for decades. And they were at the bottom of the pack on the nation's report card just a couple decades ago. But since they've expanded school choice to all families in the Sunshine State, they're now at the top of the list on the nation's report card after adjusting for differences in student demographics to make apples to apples comparisons. And they've also had 11 studies out of Florida looking at this in a rigorous way, not just correlation, to make an even more apples to apples comparison. They found that as the school choice program has expanded, the public schools have gotten a lot better. 10 out of those 11 studies on the topic find positive effects. So this is a win-win solution. And it used to be, we would make the argument based on kids being in objectively failing schools based on test scores, but the dynamic has changed in the past few years. The unions held children's education hostage to secure multiple multi-billion-dollar ransom payments from taxpayers. They were lobbying the CDC to make it more difficult to open schools during the COVID era. They got $190 billion in so-called COVID relief since March of 2020. And they were fear-mongering every step of the way. They had fake body bags and caskets, and they did not want to go back to work, but it was because they knew they could leverage those closures as a reason for why they needed more money. Talk about the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results. They always just want to throw more money at the problem, but their plan quickly backfired. As I mentioned just a bit ago, is that families got to see what was happening in the classroom. The curriculum wasn't aligned with their values. Even parents who thought things were okay because maybe they had an A rating from the state, maybe their kid was coming home with all A's on the report card, they saw that the schools were indoctrinating as opposed to educating their children. And no one wants to send their kid to a school where they feel like they're being brainwashed in ways that aren't aligned with their values. And even if you don't have kids, this book, The Parent Revolution, is really important because, one, it's showing how we're winning on the issue, and it could show how you can win on other issues as well. But the radical left socialists have been able to infiltrate the government school system so much that they don't even have to have their own kids anymore, and they can still shape the direction of our country. they can use the school system to raise other people's children. And guess what? We have about 40 to 50 million kids in America go through that system, the government school system, for 13 years of their lives, for 7 hours a day. Conservatives and independents and libertarians can't win this ideological battle simply by having more kids. You think Hollywood has a lot of impact on culture. The school system has even more of an impact on culture because they're dealing with young, impressionable minds. So this is a really important battle. In the book, I talk a lot about why we should be optimistic. I mean, look at a lot of the examples over the past year with when parents were upset, what did they first do? They went back to the school board meetings. The school boards
Right.
didn't want to listen to them. They cut off their mics. They labeled them as domestic terrorists of all things. They even had the FBI create a threat tag specifically for parents protesting at school board meetings. Well, since then, though, that was just an attempt to bully and silence parents into submission. It only backfired. Parents were emboldened to push back even harder. They've took their votes to the ballot box. And look at places like Virginia with Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat. He was a former governor. He said, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach at the final debate. That was a big mistake because Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, leaned into parental rights as a political winner. It's also a moral winner. It's the right thing to do. But he won with education voters, a Republican in a state that went 10 points to Biden, apparently, the year before. He won with those voters by 6 points. That was the #2 issue in the election. And in a way, in fact, I actually dedicated the book to Randy Weingarten and the teachers unions for overplaying their hand and inadvertently doing more to advance school choice and homeschooling than anyone could have ever imagined. If listeners want to check out the back of the book, you can also take Ted Cruz's advice, senator from Texas. He says, among other things, ruin Randy Weingarten's day by reading this book. It's their own fault, and it's absolutely glorious what's unfolding right now.
All right, you got a lot there that I want to unpack because I want to first go back to the objection to school choice because yes, I agree that the competition is healthy. By the way, and I'm in favor of school choice. I fortunately had the funds to send my kids to private schools, and but I recognize again there's a lot of problems out there within our school system prior to even COVID. And again, I think these existed a long time ago, but the problem is, though, I see with many parents not being involved in their kids' lives. They don't care whether their kids get a good grade. They don't care whether or not they're successful. They don't care about any of this. They might have had children that just are more of a nuisance. They're more addicted to drugs and alcohol. They're not going to be involved in this situation. So competition, I agree, is healthy, but what about these children that aren't able to compete anymore at that level their parents their parents aren't involved and engaged. And again, I don't think there's a better keeping them
Yeah,
there is not a
right.
good answer. Moving them is obviously a better choice, but I don't know how does that actually help those that are in that situation.
Right. So it's important that the private schools keep their autonomy. So if the student moves and they're creating disruptions in the private schools can still have their admissions processes, discipline policies. And I think that's really important to have allow private schools to be private and to let the free market operate. But at the same time, look, we can't determine policies based on outliers. And I think you got to this at the end of the question about we can't just leave them there because the status quo has all the same problems, right? You can
Right.
make the argument that there are some teachers in the public schools that do really bad things. Does that mean we should abolish all public schools? No. There are some families that might make the wrong decision, but should we punish 100% of families because 1% might not make the right decision? And at the end of the day, in general, we got to think about things in general. On average, parents know and care about their kids' educational needs than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. And so the one response to that is that the competition, so even if a family isn't choosing and they remain in the public school system, the public schools should do better, even for those kids that don't have active parents. But then also, while this isn't a silver bullet, school choice isn't going to fix all problems in society. It could help with parental involvement in children's lives because today what happens We're in a system where we've taught people to just send your kids to the government and they'll do all the work.
Right.
And so they've kind of, a lot of families have been dependent on the government, just outsourcing parenting basically to the government for 7 hours a day for 13 years. And you don't have to really choose and think about as much the education environment for your kid. But guess what? If you had the money in the hands of the families, if you allowed for school choice, now those families who might have just thrown up their hands and given up, now they have an even stronger incentive to say, hey, I have power to choose now. Maybe I'll get more involved. Maybe I'll seek out different alternatives. And now this isn't going to fix every situation, but this will, at the margins at least, push people towards being more involved just by definition with their kids' education. There was actually a study in 2018 on this topic. It's not a direct evaluation, but it's a pretty good one for what the data that we have. It's by Cornell researchers, and they found that as school choice increased in an area, all else equal, the search activity online, at least, this is a proxy, it's not a perfect measure, but the search activity for different schools online spiked as school choice spiked. And so that's not a perfect measure of parental involvement, but it does get to the idea that when you have choice and you have the power to use it, now instead of just being depressed about all the better options, you're actually engaged with finding those better solutions for your kid. Again, not a perfect solution, but it takes us in the right direction.
The DeAngelis family has been in the restaurant business for many generations. We have been serving people in the Middle Tennessee market for 34 years. Try our spaghetti kits, our pot roast, which we slow cook for 4 hours, or our world famous baked chicken and rice soup, which many locals have dubbed Greek penicillin for when you feel under the weather. We make our food fresh, and upon placing our order with us, we freeze the order and send it to your house. DeAngelis is more than a business. 5 generations of restaurant operators have taught us many things about food, but more importantly, we have recognized that we don't sell food. We sell the experience of bringing people and families together, which our country desperately needs. So go to DeAnglisFamilyKitchen.com and share in this journey today. And for right now, use the code UNCOMMON to get 10% off of your order. That's DeAnglisFamilyKitchen.com. All right, so let's touch on the teachers unions. When did teacher unions come about? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that.
They've been around for a very long time. I don't have the specific date either, but the Department of Ed started in 1979. Teacher unions predated that. And we have data from Open Secrets, a website that tracks campaign contributions. And they have data going back to 1990. They've been around a lot longer than 1990, but over the past 3 decades, 99.9% on average of the campaign contributions from one of the largest teachers unions, the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten's union, who I dedicated the book to, 99.97% in 2022 went to Democrats of those campaign contributions. And so what's interesting with school choice is that although it's not a partisan issue, you ask voters consistently from Republicans, Democrats, and independents, they support the idea. But when it comes to Democrat elected officials, they consistently vote against it. And the reason is because politicians respond more to power than they do logic or morality. And that's a big problem. But it's because of the money laundering going on, this incestuous relationship between the teachers unions and the Democrat Party. The Democrats, in too many cases, in too many places, are a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers unions. That's why they fought to keep the schools closed, because that's what the teachers union wanted. The Democrat National Party still has a YouTube video up to this day. They were slamming Trump on a campaign ad. They spent a ton of money on it about him fighting to reopen the schools. It now reads like a campaign endorsement because he was right that the schools should have been open. The risk for COVID for children was really extremely low. And everything else was open. Private schools were open, daycares were open, private businesses were open when they were allowed to be. But you had the unions fighting to close the schools. No one else was marching in the streets with coffins and fake body bags and caskets. In some places, like in Arizona, the unions were actually instructing their members and teaching them how to write a fake obituary to the governor. I mean, They were tweeting in Chicago. They deleted a tweet saying, here's a direct quote from Chicago Teachers Union. They said the push to reopen schools is rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny. I mean, they threw everything at the wall to see what would stick. They were vacationing overseas in Puerto Rico while railing against going back to work. You had Los Angeles Teachers Union in their report on reopening schools. What did they want? They wanted more money, obviously, but they also called for unrelated demands, including Medicare for all, a wealth tax, police-free schools. That's why I say they overplayed their hand, because look, when if they didn't act so crazy, unlike any other profession, and I really blame the union bosses like Randy Weingarten, who make over $500,000 a year, more so than the actual members. And I blame the system itself. The incentive is completely backwards. In the meantime, if you think about in California, I include this example in the book because it's really illuminating, and it shows the difference between the sectors. In California, there was a stupid health order that closed arbitrarily the schools, but not the daycares, because COVID was smart. It knew if you were in the same building, if you were learning something, it activated and it was going to get you. But if you were just sitting there and not learning a dang thing, if you were in a daycare, it was somehow okay. The reason was because the public school teachers unions wanted to be closed. And so the health order had to apply to schools to protect them from private competition. They didn't want families to leave and be able to go to a private school. But guess what a private Christian school did in Sacramento County? They understood that this was a stupid closure that was arbitrary, so they rebranded themselves as a daycare. They retrained all their employees as daycare workers and said, we're a daycare. We do some learning on the side, but that just goes to show you, in other states, they were also, this private schools were suing to the state to reopen. In places like Kentucky, the governor closed all the schools, and the private schools filed lawsuits to have the right to open, because they knew that if they didn't open, they might be closed for good. Their parents could take their
Right.
money elsewhere. There's competition. The public schools, it wasn't just that they could keep their jobs, but they could actually profit from keeping the doors closed, because they could say, we're not open because why? We need more money. And so it's just absolutely bonkers. And it was right before everybody's eyes. There's so many families have experience with the school system, and it was a large scale way for people to wake up and mobilize and coalesce around what I call the parent revolution. That now we have 11 states with universal school choice. It's really become the Republican Party has picked up the ball and become the parents' party, and it's happening in red states. But there are some Democrats defecting on the issue too, and the reason for that is, in my words in the book, I call it something, a phrase that I coin is bipartisanship through hyperpartisanship. And it might seem counterintuitive. How can something become bipartisan over time by, in the short run, using hyperpartisan strategies? And the reason that I say that is because the more that the Republicans lean into parental rights as a political winner, the more likely Democrats will come along and support it too if they think they're going to lose votes. Again, politicians, unfortunately, respond to power, not to logic. And once they get hit at the ballot box, like we saw with Terry McAuliffe, some Democrats will say, I don't want to be like Terry McAuliffe. I don't want to lose my election. And so
Right.
we even had Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania right before the election in 2022. He was up in the polls by double digits, but he still changed his education platform right before the election to include school choice after his opponent, Republican Doug Mastriano, who was endorsed by Trump. And by the way, my book has been endorsed by Trump as well. He endorsed it last week. I thank him for that
Oh, wow.
endorsement.
That's
But
great.
Doug Mastriano started calling Shapiro a hypocrite. He said, you went to private school. I support school choice. Why don't you? Why don't you support it for other people when you experience school choice for your own family and for yourself? Right after that, Josh Shapiro took that argument away from him, basically, put it into his platform and said, hey, I support it too. He even went on Fox News last year, reiterating his support for school choice. He ended up caving to the teachers unions. That's a separate story, who gave him over $700,000. But my point is that a high profile Democrat in Pennsylvania and in other places felt compelled to signal support for school choice, that's good news, whether it was a true change of heart or whether he was reading the tea leaves, that the political winds are shifting towards our side.
Right.
And look, I don't want to be too political on the show, but the reason I point this out is something that Milton Friedman famously said. One of his best lines, he said a lot of good things, but one of the best things he said went something along these lines. He said that the way that you change things is not about getting the right people into office. The way that you change things truly is by creating a climate of opinion that makes it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. And I think we're getting to that moment with school choice where we're having in Louisiana, 20% of the Democrats in the House voted for universal school choice a couple of weeks ago. That's not some tiny program. This is full-throated. Everybody's eligible, something that would have been unheard of just a few years ago. 20% of the Democrats voted for it. Now, look, that's not a majority. That's not, I would like it to be everybody. But for Democrats who get support from the unions and for this to be against their own party platform, to come out and say, hey, we're going to do the right thing and we don't give a crap what the unions say, that is very good news. Because why? They're paying attention to a new union, a union for the kids, the parents.
So do you think the teachers, and again, I can watch enough like Instagram reels, et cetera, and to see some of the terrible examples of teachers that are out there. I mean, and that are just, I mean, just awful human beings. I mean, again, we've always had awful human beings as teachers from time to time, as we've had in every profession. So it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think the moderate to good teachers, do you think they recognize that what the unions are doing as a negative thing, and they just can't do anything about it because it's kind of like one of those that if I want to be a teacher, I just got to pay into the union? Or are they handcuffed as well?
Yeah, I mean, the government school system is a monopoly for customers. We already knew that, right? You're assigned to the school, you can't go anywhere else. But they're also a monopsony in the labor market, as economists would put it, which means that there's basically one big employer. There's not a lot of other options. If you want to go into teaching, that's basically it. There's private schools too, but it's a much smaller fraction of the market than the government schools, which creates a monopsony situation. If you want to teach, you basically got to take whatever they're going to give you in terms of benefits and autonomy. So a lot of teachers are strapped with red tape and regulation. A lot of teachers are afraid to go to school because they're afraid that if they discipline the child, they might get a lawsuit, they might get in trouble. And so there isn't a lot of freedom for teachers either. And so reforming the system would be good for not just the students. They obviously benefit from getting a choice, but the teachers would benefit in a couple of ways. One, they might have more autonomy. I mean, in the Washington Post during the COVID era, they covered a teacher in New Jersey that started a micro school, a pandemic pod, they called it, where 10 students got together in a household. And they basically economized on the process of homeschooling. The teacher loved it. They left their public school job after decades of being in the system, and they had a smaller class size. Instead of 40, it was about 10 students. They were making the same amount of money, and they had a lot more autonomy, right? They didn't have to deal with all the government regulations. So this, a lot of the times this is framed as a battle between the teachers' unions and the families, and it is, but the teachers' unions don't even represent the interest of the good teachers. They protect the lowest common denominator. In places like New York City, they have rubber rooms where the teachers are so bad in some cases they can't even be at the school, but they can't fire them, so they put them in these things called rubber rooms and pay millions of dollars each year to just warehouse people that are not safe enough to be around the kids in the school. It's insane. Look up rubber rooms in New York City, and that makes teachers look bad, right? And so like when you saw what they did during COVID, Randy Weingarten screeching every day against conservatives and them fighting. They even made, okay, and another embarrassing example was from Chicago as well. They made an interpretive dance video in Chicago to protest going back to work. They put all the work into making a video just not to go back to actual work. And it was embarrassing. If you thought the kids in Chicago had a lot to worry about with math and reading scores, let me tell you, the dance team is screwed too, because they were not good at, the dance teachers were not very good at creating this pathetic video But that makes the profession as a whole look bad, even though most of the teachers are probably doing a good job. And, you know, and they don't, the current system doesn't benefit the best teachers because, and a lot of the teachers that are doing a good job, they leave after a few years. The best ones leave
Right.
because they look over at the into the hall and say, this guy's just showing videos to the class and the kids don't like them. And the kids, you know, I'm actually teaching and getting really good scores for the kids, and I'm putting in a lot of work, and I get high rankings from my principal. But guess what? I get paid the same as the guy that just sits there and plays videos. And so, and the unions fight for this. They fight for a single. It's called the uniform salary schedule. They don't have merit pay.
Right.
There's no incentive. And so the lowest ranking employees have a stronger incentive to stay, whereas the best ones might say, hey, instead of teaching math here, I'm going to go become an engineer. I'm going to make a lot more money somewhere else. And they don't even differentiate pay by the type of class that you're. So like someone who could go into engineering is making the same as an English teacher because it's not politically correct for some reason in the public school system to pay a math teacher higher than an English teacher. But it's not based on supply and demand. So a lot of the best employees will leave, and that's a huge problem. And the money doesn't make its way into the classroom either. We have tons of money, but there's this perpetuated myth that we don't, because we see that teachers say that they're not making enough money. And the problem is, in the US, since 1970, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, we've increased per student spending by about 170% after adjusting for inflation. Teacher salaries have only increased over that same period by about 10%. So where's the money going? Well, we do have data between 2000 and now, and the number of students in the system increased modestly by about 7%. But the number of administrators in the system increased, I'm not kidding, 90%. It's become
Wow.
more of a jobs program for administrators and adults than an education initiative for kids. And that's because they have no incentive to spend money wisely. Their incentive is to just put more and more people into the buildings. That gives them more political power. It gives them more of a voting block, but it also gives people like Randy Weingarten, the bosses, more money because that means more dues paying members. If you just spent that money on higher teacher salaries and better job security for the people in the system, they wouldn't be able to put more bodies into the system, which creates more union dues. That's what they really care about. They care about their power.
So when you mentioned, like a teacher that might get in trouble for disciplining a child, and but my understanding of unions in the private sector, you can't discipline an employee because you're going to have to deal with a union in that situation. So this teacher that disciplines a child, the union, it sounds like the union does not come and support the teacher for disciplining the child to make certain that the classrooms are orderly, organized, et cetera. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this volume of problems, of violence, of disruptive behavior, et cetera, within the schools and within the classrooms themselves. Do the unions do anything to help teachers with that area, or teachers just now said, look, we're just giving up because we don't want to deal with the parents if we go this way, and we don't want to deal with the union if we go this way? Like how do we de-evolve to that if unions were supporting them?
Yeah, it depends on the union, right? But you might have some union officials who care more about restorative justice than anything else. And so they might side with the student. But, look, even if the union did side with the teacher, the district is a problem too. So you might have a district-wide policy that says, we have to have, for example, we have to have equal disciplinary rates across race and across special need category. And this kind of stemmed from Obama's Dear Colleague letter. And one of my friends wrote a book on this, Max Eden, along with one of the fathers who had a daughter pass away from the school shooting in Parkland. The book was called Why Meadow Died. It's another one that readers should look into. But they talk about how a lot that the shooting could be traced to the restorative justice policies, which stemmed from the Dear Colleague letter. So even if teachers think that they might be protected by the union, they might not want to mess with all of that, and they might not know that it's a risk, right? If the policy says that you can't discipline at a high rate, well, then they'll be less likely to do so on the margins.
Right.
And that creates a problem not just for the teachers. I mean, they feel like they're going into a war zone in some schools. They feel like they're not safe themselves, but it creates problems for the other students. If you can't discipline, then the other students, if they want to learn, but you have one kid that's just screaming in class, throwing things, well, that disrupts everybody else's learning environment too. So it's a snowball effect.
So, all right. So moving more into your book proper itself, because you said parents kind of woke up, the union went kind of crazy, and I agree. And generally, when you have power, you go crazy extremes, thinking you need to keep it. So it's, to me, this is not a this is nothing new when you look at history. When you look at history of unions, even. But so what in your book, what was kind of some of the, like, the big things for you when you were researching this, that you're just like, oh my goodness, like, you've been involved in this for a while, but there had been something that, as you're researching this book, that just completely floored you, that was like something that was just huge. Give me an example of
Yeah.
something that was going on at that time that you that just shocked you, and was like, oh, we have to have it based off of this story alone.
Yeah, I mean, the unions were lobbying the CDC to keep the schools closed. We uncovered that with FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act. And I went over some of the other examples of just the nonstop fear mongering. But even in Florida, a lot of people don't think about this because Florida had the schools open before a lot of other places. But even then, the union sued Governor DeSantis to try to close the schools. It was despite their best efforts to keep the schools closed that they still opened the schools, because the unions lost that battle. But they were fear mongering with a hearse. They had a hearse at one of their rallies to keep the schools closed. They drove a hearse around with Governor DeSantis's face to say, "Oh, you're trying to kill us," basically, if you want to open the schools. No one else did this. It was ridiculous. But another thing that was kind of a light bulb moment for me as to why I wrote the book was something called the red state strategy. So for a long time in the school choice movement, I mentioned earlier, we had very incremental reform. It was small wins here and there, not this, breakthrough that we've had recently. And I think one of the mistakes back historically in the school choice movement is that we tried to pretend it was a bipartisan issue. So we would make a lot of left-leaning arguments for school choice, which they were all good arguments. You can make left and right-leaning arguments for school choice. It's competition, it's a market-based improvement, it's families getting to choose schools that align with their values. It's an equalizer. The least advantaged are stuck in the worst government school. So you can make a whole host of different arguments from different backgrounds as to why school choice is a good idea. But when we leaned too much into the left-leaning arguments to try to make Democrats feel bad, to try to get them to vote for it, even if they agreed with us privately, they wouldn't vote for it. So it didn't translate to the success that we would have liked. And that's because, again, politicians care more about politics and power than they do about logic or morality. And so that didn't get us the Democrat votes. And it also might have turned off some of the Republicans who said, hey, I don't really feel compelled to vote for this. If this isn't a Republican thing, if I don't vote for it, it's not going to be a big deal, right? And so what I talk about in the book through the red state strategy is to hold Republicans accountable for this and not lean too far into the lefty rhetoric, make it a GOP litmus test issue. And we've seen that unfold. And it's partially because Republican primary voters were pissed off about what they saw in the schools. We saw from Gallup, the national survey found that the latest data showed that there's an all-time low support in the public school system overall. And with conservatives and Republicans, that number was below 10% confidence in the public school system. With Democrats, it's a little higher, but with Republicans, it was extremely low. And I think that's because the radical left has understood that they could use the school system to mold the minds of other people's children And it's not that this just happened out of nowhere, that there was, propaganda in the schools that just started out of nowhere in 2020. It's been like that for a while. It's just, and you mentioned this earlier, the way that I would put it is that COVID didn't break the public school system. It was already broken. And the sunlight is the best disinfectant. Now we have social media, which, look, social media has a lot of downsides, but the upside here is that we can expose the rot in the corrupted system. And Libs of TikTok has done a good job of that. I've done a lot of examples of that, exposing things happening in the classroom. And at the end of the day, the problem is more so about forcing people into a one size fits all system that by definition is never going to meet the needs of individual families who just disagree about how they want to raise their kids. It's okay to disagree about those things. What's not okay is when you have a special interest, namely the teachers unions, getting to control how to raise other people's children. The choice should be in the hands of the families. And competition obviously improves test scores, but it could also improve the cohesiveness of a school. If you're going too far off the rails, whether you're going too far left or too far right, if you're in a competitive market, you're going to lose some customers. And so school choice should decrease the polarization in the public schools too.
In Acts 5, we see that when Peter and the other disciples were ordered to stop talking about Jesus, they responded, "We obey God and not man." In 2020, we saw something we never thought we could see in this country. They shut down our churches. After decades of removing God from schools and public institutions, they went straight at our community. Unfortunately, we as Christians did not know what to do. And even worse, we chose to listen to false prophets masquerading as Christians on how to respond. I recognize this is the only beginning, and we need to know how to respond. We have a duty to say no to unjust laws, but as Christians, we have a greater duty to God. In my book, On the Duty of Christian Civil Disobedience, I use biblical teachings to help believers know when and how to stand up to those in charge when they ask us to commit evil. You can go to peterdemas.org to find out about our duty to say no. And when you type in the code UNCOMMON, you can get 10% off your order. That's UNCOMMON at peterdemas.org. Remember, we are to obey God and not man.
If those incentives translate into the classroom and with the school boards, they shouldn't have they probably won't cut off your mic anymore. They probably won't call you a domestic terrorist anymore. And that was one of the big surprising things I outlined in the book too. You actually had the National School Boards Association send a letter invoking the Patriot Act of all things to label parents for quote unquote domestic terrorism. It was later uncovered that in a previous draft of the NSBA letter to Biden, that they were going to invoke that the military be deployed to school board meetings. Insane. And the National Guard they were calling to go be deployed to school board meetings to quell the speech of parents who had the audacity to have more of a say in their kids' education. This whole idea of democratic accountability that the left would always talk about when they were discussing public schools and how they would listen to you if you just showed up at the school board meeting. We saw that they didn't really mean it. They really only said that if you agreed with them, then it was great to speak your mind. But if not, they were going to bully and silence you into submission. I'm glad though that parents didn't take that advice. It backfired. They pushed back even harder. And now, since that letter was sent to Biden, 26 states have left the School Boards Association. 26. They still have school boards in these different states, but they have left the national organization, right, which shows that it's again, this is a story of hope. Parents have power. They've become a political juggernaut, and it depends on them waking up, caring about their kids, and locking arms. And when they do, they can become more powerful and influential than the teachers unions because they care about their kids more than anybody else. And parents and grandparents outnumber the employees in the system. So we can win this war. We are winning in these 11 states, and it's spreading to more states as we're having this conversation today. And I think the momentum is not going to quell down because parents aren't going to unsee what they saw in 2020.
Right.
And even though the schools are open, the problems are still there.
You mentioned the school board. I find that when I talk with people, and the lack of recognition that their lives are impacted more by local and state elections than they are by federal elections. And unfortunately, with places, with news cycles like CNN and Fox News, that's what we watch the most, which is obviously going to cover national a lot more. So they don't recognize a lot of the stuff. But that also leads to school boards, because I'll talk to people about school board elections. And I was guilty of this many, many years ago when I was young. I'm like, I don't care about a school board. My kids were
Hmm.
little, I didn't care. Didn't see the impact of it, or didn't even have kids. I didn't, so if I voted on it, I doubt I did, for school board. I was probably one of those I didn't know, but if I did, it was a name I recognized. And okay, but I had no idea what they believed in. I probably met them somewhere. I think we have this problem and tendency that if you don't have kids that are actively involved in public schools, then the school board meetings are ignored. The school board elections are ignored. What do you recommend for people on how to get involved in that? And even with, I mean, because I think hopefully
Hmm.
now they're seeing that the impact on these schools are actually impacting them as well. These
Yep,
kids that are graduating now are probably going to be taking care of me when I get older. How do you advise
exactly.
people to get involved in this system when they don't have kids?
Yeah, I would say one, have a reframe. Think about it differently, because this is about the future of our country. And even if you don't have kids in the system, even if you don't have grandkids in the system, even if you just homeschool and you don't want to deal with it, even if your policy priority is other issues, maybe you really care about taxes, maybe you really care about um, reducing crime. Well, these things are all connected. And I would say the root of the problem is the government school system. When you fail to get a good education, guess what? And when you're being indoctrinated to like big government and think that that's the solution to all of your problems, those kids are going to turn out into society and vote to take away your freedoms in the future. They're going to vote to raise your taxes. They're going to vote um, to create a whole lot of havoc in other areas and too, and have social justice, restorative justice policies when it comes to crime. You'll be less safe as well. And so this fight is more important than just your own kids. That's obviously the most important piece of it, of the puzzle, but it also has profound effects on the rest of society, because the radical left has figured out they can raise your kids for you using the school system, whether you like it or not, and try to shape their how they're going to turn out when they're older. And that's a huge problem. And I think that is why we've seen the parent revolution. I talked about the red state strategy earlier, and it has more to do with that than just messaging on left versus right leaning messages. It's also making it more about values than test scores. I mean, school quality is multidimensional. Test scores is just one part of that equation. People care about safety. People care about the values of the school, the mission of the school, and they don't want to send their kid to an institution that's indoctrinating them to dislike their own family and to hate their country. And so this is a bigger revolution than just one for your own kids. And so that's why I recommend everybody get the copy today, The Parent Revolution. It's actually now, as of this week, a national bestseller. It just went up on the
Oh, that's great.
USA Today bestsellers list. And I also include, like we talked a lot about school choice, but that's not the only policy. We should fight this battle on multiple fronts. And there's a ton of policies I include that can tweak the current system beyond school choice, including let's have more transparency. Where's the money going in the public schools? What's the curriculum in the public schools? They should have to tell families what their curriculum actually is. Don't keep secrets from parents. You would think this would be an easy policy, but you do have some places like in California where the
Mhm.
state is raining down on school districts, trying to force them to keep secrets about gender ideology. If your kid changes gender at school, they want the school to keep that a secret from kids' own parents. It's absolutely ridiculous. They think that it's their kids, not your kids. But the kids do not belong to the government, and that should piss off parents more than anything else. But also, when it comes to the school board elections, these are usually held at random times, not with the general election. The turnout is extremely low, which the unions really like, because They're a special interest. They're the ones that are more likely to turn out with low turnout elections, so they can have an outsized influence on handpicking their candidates that will pass socialist agendas, and they'll be able to shape your school. Even if they're not in the majority, they can have a minority in the population controlling everybody else's education. So why not just push to align that election with the general election? Parents will have more of a fighting chance at actually winning these battles if it's not just the union showing up to vote.
So we're getting kind of close to the end. One of the things that I've saw, my sister's much older than I am, and she was in the middle of high school, in the middle of the busing crisis. You know, we're in the schools that were creating some problems there. And my father discovered that she was getting these A's, she was getting these great grades, but she didn't know basic math, and she was getting A's in math. It was just one of those that was just kind of pass them on, just to kind of go from there. And you know, he was very upset and very unhappy about it, and he fought to no avail to actually lower her grade, because he's like, she didn't deserve it, you know, and they wouldn't do it, even though she, again, she acknowledges that she didn't earn the grade. You know, that problem I still see translated now, you know, where again, it is all about that grade. How do parents get more involved to find out about a lot of the stuff that's going on in their schools without, because again, if my kids got good grades, I kind of left them alone. You know, I was kind of like, when they got bad
Mhm.
grades is when I was like, okay, what's going on? What's wrong? Why aren't you studying enough? You know, um, so how can parents give
Yeah.
some advice to parents out there to get involved, and maybe
Yeah.
something like that can come up to the surface when they find out, hey, there might be another issue or involvement in that. What do you
Yeah.
suggest to them?
Go to the school board meeting, seeing what's being discussed, but also have weekly meetings with the teacher or the principal, whoever you can get a hold of. And if they're not wanting to talk to you, that's probably an alarm bell right there. If they don't want to share the curriculum with you, maybe then you might want to do some more digging as well. And there's been some other parents that have just tried to do basic, kind of information seeking from school districts, and they've gotten kind of ghosted from the employees in the system, and that kind of raised alarm bells, and lo and behold, they found there was some much deeper problems going on. So just doing a little bit of of conversation and communication with the employees could be helpful, but also take a more active role in your child's education. What are they bringing home for homework? What are they working on? Again, it can be easy to get caught in the trap of, well, I send my kids to the public school, I'm paying for the public school through taxes, I'm going to let them handle it. No, these are your kids. And guess what? You're the first educator for your child. Before they entered kindergarten, how are they learning things? Well, you are their guide, you are their parent, you are their first and foremost educator, you are their best educator. And don't ever forget that. How do they learn when they come home from school? They're learning things from you at all times, whether you know it or not. And so um, take pride in being the best educator for your kids, and don't see it as an either or. Either you're homeschooling them or you're sending them to another school. You can be involved in that education, and you should be involved in that education of your child, because this is your kid, not their kid.
You know, they don't have any issue whatsoever if their kids are playing sports to help practice at home. So there's no reason why they can't do that through education either. You know, one of the things we used to do with my children at dinner time, we would ask, not because we asked what happened at school, nothing. How was school? Fine. You know, but when we would ask at dinner time, we would say, what happened in school that we can pray for? It was
uh,
incredible, because then they're submitting a prayer to God that they're wanting us to pray for, and then they released so much information that we had no idea what was going on based off of
mhm.
that. And so anyway, I highly recommend that for people who are listening. So your book, obviously you're now they could find it probably in a lot of places now that you're on
Yep.
the national bestseller list. I'm assuming Amazon, Books a
Yep.
Million, Barnes and Noble, all that
Everywhere.
stuff.
Yep.
Anywhere else that they can get it, get your book?
Anywhere, just Google the parent, or look up whatever search engine you use, the parent revolution, and you'll find it. But yeah, it's on the USA Today bestseller list. It's available on Amazon, Books a Million, Barnes and Noble. You can even get it at Target or Walmart. It's basically everywhere. And look, I Trump endorsed it. Senator Ted Cruz has endorsed it, and there are many other important endorsements as well. But this is a guidebook on how to. It first lays out why we're winning. It shows how we're winning, and it shows different specific policy recommendations on how we can continue winning on the issue of school choice, but also tweaking the school system. And look, this fight is more important than just about anything else. Even if you care about any other policy, the root of the problem is having millions of kids churn through a system where they learn that big government is the answer to all of their problems. This is how you can shape and save our country. And so you can take Ted Cruz's advice. You can ruin Randy Weingarten's day by reading this book. And yeah, hope you guys check it out. It's currently, if you do look on Amazon, I don't know how long this is going to last, but as of the time of this recording, it is 25% off on Amazon, and it just hit the bestseller list. And so hopefully, if you guys can get a copy, if you want more than one copy, you can also send another one to your local school board member or your union boss, and maybe they'll learn a little something as well.
Well, that's great. Again, I thank you. And for those people out there who don't have kids yet or are about to have children or have babies, highly recommend you get this book, because you got to recognize that it's 18 years later. It's not where the school system is now. Your school system might be great now, but you got to think about your school system, when they're like 10 years old, 10 years old, when they're 12 years old, 20 years or 18 years old, hopefully not 20. But anyway, as they go through this process, I think it's very important. And it's one of those things I think parents ignore, and they only look at kindergarten. They're not looking at their entire system as a whole. So I highly encourage parents to get this, people who want to be parents to get this, and for anyone else that's interested in helping prepare and protect their future. So again, I really appreciate, Corey. I really appreciate you being on. This is a great conversation. I learned a lot about it as well. I think it's very important, and I'm so thankful that you're doing this, and I'm glad you wrote this book, and I'm glad it's selling. That means it's working, and hopefully we're going to move to 11 to 12 very soon, and continue to make that number grow.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter.
All right, thank you again. I appreciate it.